Hello, this is Mindaleo Jacobs. I'm here doing a quick video to try to condense 70 years of research and thought and theory into a very quick overview as we're looking at leadership that is contingent, specifically looking at leadership and the contingency models that have been presented in our class thus far. So the contingency theories, there are a few of them that were presented in our readings. The contingency leadership theory and model initially, that first one there, followed by the leadership continuum, the path goal leadership, normative leadership, and leadership substitutes, which was sort of like an add-on at the end. So as we look at contingency leadership theory, in its entirety, the text talks about there being a model, and there is a model that can be applied to each of these contingency leadership theories. And they include the variables of followers, which we liken to employees or subordinates. They use those words interchangeably. Looking at the leader, the boss, the manager, which we know that manager sometimes takes on that negative connotation. Then, of course, we have the situation, the task in which, or the environment, that sort of thing, in which the work is to be performed. So then we look at just a very brief introduction by the initial work that was done by Fred Fiedler, okay, in 1951. Very simple idea of where it was looking at fit. And it's so funny that as I look at leadership now, we talk about fit even now, whether or not there's a good fit as a leader in education, whether there's a fit for principal at different sites. But Fiedler talks specifically about like this sort of like decision-making tree, sort of like a flow chart. His idea was that if your particular leadership style, right, the contingent part that makes the whole dependency thing happen is predicated on whether or not the leader possesses a certain ability or skill, that if they do not have that skill, then they are to find basically new work. And so I said that if there's no fit, then you must quit, right? And so some of the criticisms of this theory initially was that it's that whole notion of fitting, right? Do you fit in or do you not? Then you are to change the scope or to change the context of the work and not necessarily change yourself as a leader. So don't change your style. So then as we moved on to the leadership continuum theory, okay, a brief history and overview, we're still in the 1950s, and we're looking at there being a continuum of basically where the behaviors or the ideas are coming from. So we have our boss, and that person, I wouldn't necessarily say is at the top, but these decisions are made from the boss all the way down to the subordinates, right? Let's fit in there nicely. We have the followers, we have the leader, and then we also have the situation. So in this one, we're looking at who's the boss, right? So who's the boss? So in this, you have a little play here where you have either the boss or the subordinates making the decisions. And so you have a choice of 7 different styles that were introduced here that could maximize performance. Now, some of the criticisms for this one is that it wasn't quite clear when you were going through the process where to really kind of start. And in some places, you had to kind of make it up, make a decision, right? And that will then determine sometimes the outcome. So it wasn't as prescriptive as a lot of folks would have liked it to be. It's so funny. I always think about in a time where leaders want to be themselves, there's that autonomy piece or whatever. The last thing they want to do as the boss is to be told what to do, right? I mean, you do want to be effective, but that whole notion of, okay, you want me to try something on, but it's not clear as to how I will go about doing that. All right. So now we're looking at the path goal leadership theory model. Again, 1971. So we're getting, a little closer to more contemporary information. In 1971, a good 40 some odd years ago, 50 years actually this year. Wow. Robert House. All right. So we have no trait or behavior variable to leader as with the previous theories. So we're not really looking at the traits or the behavior variable necessarily for the leader, as we did in the previous two. But there is a choice for you to use one of four styles. Those styles are directive, supportive, participative, achievement oriented. And based on the motivation theories of goal setting and expectancy, so those are some additional theories, but we're looking at basically that whole notion of if you're working hard, that you should be able to be rewarded equally, right? Some of the criticisms for this is that it's a little more complex, right? A little more specific than the continuum leadership theory that we were just looking at. But still, there wasn't as much clarity around which style to use at which time, right? So when are we to use that? And then again, you have that whole notion of judgment calls, right? And that the 6 situational factors that were introduced weren't necessarily as clear and limited to take in consideration all of the different scenarios that can come about or that the leader may face. So normative leadership theory, okay, 1973, we're looking at Vroom and Yelton, Yedden initially. Then you have in 1988, Vroom is still working on some things with Jago. Then as late as the 2000 with Vroom. All right. So I was saying that this one was like, what time is it? Right. And so what is a critical variable in this particular theory is the notion of time. The very first questions that a leader would ask is whether or not I am to lead the work, or should I then delegate it or allow my followers or the subordinates to then lead the work. So should I build consensus or should I just command? Okay, so there was a sequential set of questions to determine the best leadership style. So there are several participation styles that were introduced, and they range from where we will talk about the command or the first part where the boss makes the decisions, all the way down to the delegation. So you would see that the consulting of the individual or an individual, the consulting of a group, and then of course to facilitate and then delegate. Criticisms of this is that decisions are not single episodes, but they take multiple meetings and multiple times where folks get together and discuss this, whatever may be coming up that the leader is being faced with, where a decision needs to be made. Then there's also the notion or the idea of being able to say whether or not the leader has the ability to utilize the skills necessary to pull this particular theory off, okay? So there are some other things to also consider as we're talking about contingencies. We have the things that are dependent on certain variables. They also talk about whether or not there is a prescription or a description, okay? And so as we're looking at that, the theories of contingency and normative are prescribed, right? Where they're talking specifically about the things that leaders should consider, questions that should be asked, sort of like a flow chart. Then you have the continuum and the path goal, which are more descriptive, describes the information, but not really clear on how to, go through the process. Then also some other considerations would be to take in consideration who's doing the leading, right? Whether or not there is even a need for a leader. Okay. And so in some situations, the work could be laid out in such a way that it's clear where the subordinates are working towards. Um, Maybe the workers are competent, they don't require leadership, or the task oriented leadership that comes with a leader kind of driving the work or pushing forward the work. It could be that in that case that the leader is not necessarily needed, right? Then there's also things that are out beyond the leader's control as far as his impact that he has on the subordinates. Okay, and so with that being said, things such as location, and I'm reminded of our program as a county program here in San Diego, California. We have an entire county that we're responsible for. 40 some odd school districts that are within our county program. And what you would have is community schools littered throughout the county. And you would have maybe one or two executive directors, followed by 4 to 5 principals who are responsible for, let's say a good 27 different community schools, not including the 3, I think there's 2, what I call gated communities, detention facilities, juvenile detention facilities. And so as a result, there are so many more sites that where the leader is just not able to get there. So there has to be a certain level of trust. There has to be a great level of competency from the workers, right, to hold down an entire site without a principal or the support of any other staff members, maybe a paraprofessional or paraeducator, or maybe even a instructional aide of sorts, which is a paraprofessional. But the leader themselves will not be there personally on site to be able to lead per se. All right. So one of the criticisms of this is basically that in some situations when you are saying that there's no need for a leader, sometimes those individuals do emerge. And them coming out, they're effectively or essentially acting in the same role as the leader, just calling them something a little bit different. Thinking of that saying that if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then it is a duck, right? But if you don't give it the appropriate title, then folks think that they're really doing something a little bit different. But that's all that I have, and thank you so much.